Hi, I'm Wes Allison, author of His Robot Girlfriend and other science fiction and fantasy stories. Today I'd like to share with you the first chapter of my book Brechalon. Brechalon is book 0 in the series The Sorceress and the Dragon, and is designed to set up the story as a prequel. It's available for a free download at smashwords.com, and the remaining books in the series are available wherever ebooks are sold, and in paperback at Amazon. Brechalon, Chapter 1, The Greatest City in the World. There's no doubt about it. Brec City was the greatest city in the world. Not the best, but the greatest. It was the capital of the United Kingdom of Greater Brechalon and had been the center of Brec culture for almost 2,000 years. 15 centuries ago, it had been the largest city in the world, and it still was. With a population of more than 4 million, it dwarfed Nettin, Bangdorf, Zog, Perfico, and the other capital cities in the continent of Sumer. The great city, as most Brecs called their home, was filled with majestic buildings and monuments, magnificent parks and spacious plazas. But beyond these were seemingly endless reaches of tenement apartment buildings, slapped up with none of the forethought and planning of the ancient structures of which the citizens were so proud. Though the vast system of horse-drawn trolleys and hansom cabs reminded everyone of the past, the oily black telegraph poles and the chugging, honking, steam-powered carriages gave voice to a future bearing down at record speed. Nothing about the great city was lost on Captain Terence de Chantain. He'd been back in the city for exactly 1 hour 15 minutes, but it seemed as if he had never left. As he strode down Avenue Phoenix, he looked at the shops on either side of the street, occupying the ground floor of buildings that had been old when his great-grandfather had been born. The cobblestone streets were filled with vehicles. Shiny new steam carriages swerved to avoid running over an old man pulling a donkey heavily laden with crates of produce, the trolley's bell reminding everyone on the street that by law it had the right of way, even though the massive horse pulling it was far slower than the newest marvels of technology. Turning sharply to his left, Terence crossed the road, dodging neatly between a horse-drawn carriage and one of the steam-powered variety, and entered one of the storefronts, breeding booksellers. The interior of the bookseller's shop was dark and crowded, and it smelled of old leather, old paper, and old glue. Terence took a slow, deep breath, enjoying the fragrance the way some people might enjoy the scent of a rose. An old, bespectacled man lifted his head from behind a massive volume of Dodson. He raised his eyebrows when he saw Terence's blue and khaki cavalry uniform. Terence removed his slouch hat and fished his wallet from the interior of his vest pocket. "What can I do for you, sir?" asked the bookseller. "Revenge," said Terence without smiling. A momentary look of panic crossed the older man's face, but then his eyes widened. "Garstone?" Terence nodded. "Yes, I have several copies behind the counter. Not the type of theme I'd expect an army officer to be reading." "Don't judge a book by its cover," said Terence. "One would think that a bookseller would know that." "Indeed." The man paused and then pulled out several different editions of the infamous work of Kezia Garstone. He looked up to study his customer's face. "So many people are interested in this one, either for its politics or its indecencies." "You don't have a first edition?" asked Terence, his face giving nothing away. "Oh, I do, but I'm afraid it's not inexpensive." Opening a small cupboard behind him, the bookseller pulled out a book wrapped in linen and placed it on the counter. With great care he unwrapped the cloth, exposing a green leather-bound book with gold leaf edging. 250 marks. "I wonder what Garstone would say about such profiteering," said Terence, opening his wallet and pulling out 5 crisp banknotes that together equaled the stated amount. "Oh, I think she wouldn't mind. You know, if you're interested, I might have a lead on a signed first edition of Steam." "Really? How much?" 4,000 marks. "Kafir's tit," said Terence, chuckling as the older man winced at his blasphemy. "I'm afraid that's beyond my allowance." The man nodded knowingly. "Would you like me to wrap it for you?" "Nope." Terence took the book and tucked it under his arm. "Is there still a fish and chips cart by the park?" "Oh, yes." Terence exited the store and turned left, heading for Hexagon Park. He had to jog across Prince Tybalt Boulevard, which was at least twice as crowded as Avenue Phoenix. He was almost hit twice, but arrived at the park's edge unscathed. Hexagon Park, as the name implied, was an expansive park built on a six-sided shape of a hexagon. It was filled with fountains, ponds, walkways, flower gardens, orchards, and at its center, a plaza with a steam-powered calliope. Terence could hear the music playing even at this distance. Along the sidewalk at the edge of the park, several vendors were selling food from carts. He purchased a newsprint cone filled with fried fish and golden chips and made his way down the cobblestone path to the center of the park, taking a seat about 50 feet away from the bright red music machine. The calliope made as much music as an entire band playing. People clearly enjoyed it, though only a few were gathered to watch it. Most followed along by bobbing their heads or humming as they smelled the flowers, looked into the fountains, or strolled along the fruit trees. Terence ate his fish and chips and propped open his new book on his knee. His attention was pulled away from the pages, though, by the other people and their various activities. Directly in front of him, an older man in a brown bowler was throwing bits of bread to the flying reptiles that could be found all over the city. Disgusting things. To Terence's mind, they should be shot rather than fed. Several small children were playing doggy-doggy on an open expanse of grass. Their simple homespun clothing and the fact that they were unsupervised indicated that they were from poorer, working-class families. Beyond them were several large groups of people wandering past the fruit trees, among them a man in a dark brown overcoat that looked far too warm for this time of year. As Terence watched, several people approached the man and exchanged money for small packages pulled from the expansive coat. The man was a drug dealer. The young officer's eyes itched and began to water, and when he stood up to drop his garbage in the dustbin, he could feel his hands starting to twitch. He took 2 steps in the direction of the drug dealer. Then the man in the overcoat looked in his direction and just seemed to melt away into the crowd. Terence was just thinking about following when he felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. He turned to find a very large police constable holding on to him. "Now, where are you off to?" "All these people and you stop me?" Terence wondered. "Just keeping the peace. Someone from out of town might not recognize that fellow you were eyeing as trouble. Then again he might. Either way, there's no reason a fine young officer of His Majesty's service should be getting mixed up with the likes of him." "I'll take your word for it." "Do you have a place to stay in the city?" asked the PC, taking a small notebook and a short pencil from his pocket. "My family has a house here." "And where would that be?" "Number 1 Avenue Dragon." The police constable's eyes shot from his notebook back to Terence's face. "That would be Miss... then she would be... my baby sister." Putting his notebook away with as much nonchalance as he could muster, the PC smiled and then bowed slightly at the waist. "If I can be of further service." It wasn't a question, and in any case the constable left before Terence could reply. Terence studied his own hand and noted that it was no longer shaking. Might as well go home. Get it over with. Then maybe he could find a quiet corner to sit and read Garston. Meanwhile, 7-year-old Senta Bly lay in one of the grassy fields in the northern half of Hexagon Park and looked up at the brown haze in the air above her as she listened to the sound of the calliope and tried to catch her breath. She'd spent most of the morning playing with her cousin, Morrow McCourt, and a dozen other children from the vast sea of tenements, who met each morning at the park and played a host of childhood games. Morrow, who despite being 5 months younger than Senta always looked out for her, nudged her and handed her half a piece of cheese that he had that morning wrapped in a napkin and stuffed in his pocket. As she chewed it, she turned her head to the side and watched some of the children running away. "What's up?" she asked Morrow. "There's a wizard setting up over there," he replied. Climbing to their feet, they ran in the direction that the other children had gone. Sure enough, a man in a brown suit but wearing a black cape had placed his bowler hat on the grass upside down so that people could throw money in, and he was already performing his magic. He swirled his right hand around in a circle parallel to the ground and spoke a series of magic words. "Uathanum Isezek," he grinned. "I give you the floating platform." Though it was invisible, there was a disc-shaped platform just below where he had formed a circle with his hands, and the children rushed forward to sit on it. A few even tried to stand, though they were quickly pushed off by those who wanted their turn. The round field of force lasted only a few minutes, and then it was gone, and the wizard was on to his next trip. He charmed a woman and made her act like a chicken, and then he summoned a horse out of thin air. He turned a boy's hair blue, and he made a passing steam carriage's horn meow like a cat. His grand finale was to induce snow to fall from the hazy but relatively cloud-free sky. This earned him cheers from the children, and more than a few coins in his hat from the adults, despite the snow only lasting a few minutes and none of it sticking. "It's time to go home," Morrow told Senta as the wizard gathered his earnings. Senta thought she saw the wizard giving her a strange look as she passed, but she paid little attention. Wizards were strange folk. She raced after her cousin, who shot across Avenue Phoenix, dodging in and around traffic. They ran all the way to the great Church of the Holy Savior, which marked the edge of the old city. Then they skipped their way through block after block of tenement buildings. At last they arrived at their own building, a 15-story stone structure that leaned ever so slightly to the right. Tramping up the narrow steps, they reached their granny's apartment on the 12th floor. Together the two children pressed against the door, tumbling inside when Morrow turned the knob. They expected to find Granny, and indeed they did, but they were surprised to find her leaning over a tiny bassinet, gooing at the contents. Near her, sitting on the floor, was a toddler with very fine, very blonde hair. There were already 4 children living with Granny: Senta and Morrow, Morrow's brother Geert, and their cousin Bertice. Now it appeared that there were 2 more. "This is Didrika," said Granny, patting the toddler on the top of the head, "and this is her baby sister Ernst." Senta stepped quickly across the room and stared down into the bassinet, Morrow at her side. The sleeping baby inside couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. The few wisps of hair on her head were strawberry blonde, and the tiny bow-shaped mouth was pursed, as if she was dreaming of a bottle. "Ah, cute," said Senta. "We're not going to have enough food," said Morrow. "We'll make do," said Granny, "but you two will have to go to work. Morrow, Mr. Blackwell has secured a place for you at his printing shop, and Senta, you will work at the cafe in the Great Plaza." "Who are they, anyway?" asked Morrow, indicating the new children. "They are your cousins. My boy Colin was their father. He died in the war. Now they've lost their mother to a fever." 20 minutes later, Morrow and Senta were making the long trip downstairs to the sub-basement to get a bucket of coal. "I guess we have to grow up now," Morrow said. "I don't see why those damn kids have to come here." "Their parents are dead," Senta replied, "just like yours and mine." "Your parents aren't dead." Granny said so." "I heard your mom just didn't want you." "Who wouldn't want me?" said Senta. "I'm just cute." Morrow made a non-committal noise, and they continued down the stairs. Meanwhile, Yolanthe de Chantaine pursed her lips and narrowed her unique aquamarine eyes at the man in front of her, who seemed to wilt in her gaze. They were in one of the back bedrooms of the de Chantaine house at No. 1 Avenue Dragon. Occupying an entire city block and sitting 4 stories high, the house had dozens of bedrooms, so many that Yolanthe was sure she hadn't visited them all. She'd been in this one, though, many times. Not recently. So many rooms made the house expensive to heat and to care for, and right now Yolanthe needed her money for things other than taking care of a too large house. She'd ordered all the rooms in the back 2/3 of the building closed off, the furniture covered, and the other contents sold or stored. But this room was untouched. The dust-covered furniture was still home to dust-covered personal items: brush, razor, strop, journal, war medals, shotgun. "Well," she said, ice clinging to the consonants and a cold wind blowing through the vowel sound. The servant actually shivered. "I didn't think you meant this room," said the man. "And why would that be?" "This is the master's room. It was his room. I thought—" "My brother is master of this house now, and you are not paid to think." Yolanthe could feel the presence of Zia Corlon, her head butler, just behind her right shoulder, but she didn't acknowledge him. "I said I wanted all these rooms closed off, and that includes this one. Cover the furniture and sell the other things, and if you can't sell them, burn them." The man nodded shakily. Yolanthe turned on her heel. Zia was standing just far enough to the side that he wouldn't have to move as she walked directly back out of the room. He was a tall, dignified man with clear, intelligent eyes and hair that was a bit more salt than pepper. He had served the Deschantain family since before Yolanthe was born, and his family had served them since the time of Yolanthe's great-great-grandfather. He stood completely straight, his right hand resting on the shoulder of a boy of 13 or 14. Yolanthe raised one eyebrow. Zia cleared his throat. Young Saba here needs to be assigned a position in the house. He is engaged in his studies, yes? I believe I pay for a tutor, do I not? Yes. But Saba had his 14th birthday some time ago. It's time for him to work in the afternoons, after finishing with Master Lockley. Do you have an opinion? I was thinking assistant porter. Very well. Yolanthe took 3 steps toward the door, then stopped and turned around. What did he receive for his birthday? You gave him a very nice pair of pants. Perfect, she said. Miss, said Zia, leaving the boy where he was and stepping forward. He stood looking at her as if measuring whether he should continue. Yes, she said at last. Might you not want to keep some items of a more personal nature? Nothing of my father's is of interest to me or my brothers. He was a disgrace to the family name, and the sooner I can forget about him, the better. Wastrel. Coward. She pressed her lips together to say the other word. How she wanted to say it. Murderer. But the word stayed in her mouth. She stared at Zia, daring him to ask something else. Yes, miss. It took a full 10 minutes to walk from the back to the front of the house, that portion which was in use, and once there it took far longer to reach her boudoir. She had to detour around the hallway where workmen were busy installing an elevator. It was the last of many improvements that Yolanthe had made to the house over the past 2 years. Ewa was waiting in the boudoir. Ewa was Yolanthe's dressing maid, as well as being Zia's daughter. 2 years younger than Yolanthe, Ewa had grown up with her and her brothers. There was a time that Yolanthe had thought of the younger woman as a sister. Without a word, she turned and shrugged off her jacket, which Ewa caught and immediately placed on a hanger. Then she was back to unbutton Yolanthe's day dress and help her remove it. This was followed by the large bustle that was made vital by modern fashion, and then by the Prudence Plus fairy bus form corset. And for the first time all day, Yolanthe was able to take a deep breath. I won't need you for a few hours, she said, as Ewa draped her day gown over her shoulders. You may retire. Thank you, miss. I'm going to write Augie. Do you want me to send him your regards? Yes, miss. As Ewa left the room, Yolanthe sat down at a small desk in the corner and pulled out a sheet of her personal stationery and her fountain pen. In her best hand, she wrote her letter. Augie, I read with interest your description of Bermesia. It sounds like just the type of place for our enterprise. I was especially interested in the fact that there are as yet no other parties intent on establishing a colony there. It is distant, but that may well end up being an advantage. Terence has put forth Cartonia as a possibility, but with your experience in Bermesia, we will have first-hand information and expertise. Continue to learn all you can. You know what we need. I don't have to tell you. In any case, I have a meeting with the Prime Minister later in the week, and I hope to begin negotiations. On a personal note, Terence arrived yesterday. He looks as well as can be expected. Ewa sends her regards. As always, return with your shield or on it. Sincerely, I, Deschantain. Ewa Corlon arrived in the servants' dining hall just a moment after her father and Saba. Half a dozen kitchen workers, under the supervision of the head cook, Mrs. Colbshallow, scurried around preparing for the luncheon. Mrs. Colbshallow had been the head cook since Ewa was a little girl. She was a wonder in the kitchen. She was also Saba's mother, and she gave him a big squeeze as she passed by. There's my handsome boy, she said. Mother, he whined back. Are you looking for something to eat, dear? Mrs. Colbshallow asked Ewa. Yes, I'd better eat while I have the chance. You know how she is. Don't get cheeky, said her father. I'll get you a nice plate, the head cook replied, waving over to one of the kitchen staff. I do think you need to put on a bit of weight. You can't catch a man if you're all skin and bones. Don't worry about that, said Yua, sitting down across the table from Saba. I'm not likely to run into a man around here, and if I did, no man is going to be interested in me. Saba's adoring gaze, which Yua chose to ignore, said as plainly as words that he thought he was interested, and he thought no other man was worthy of the position. But it was her father who spoke. You're far too young to worry about a man. Why, you're barely 20. I'm 23, Papa. Another 2 years and I'll be an old maid. Nonsense, said Mrs. Colbshell, setting down in front of Yua a plate with a large sandwich atop a tremendous pile of golden chips. You're still young, and you can find a man easily enough if, Well, are you determined that he be of your faith? Of course she is, said Zia. As long as he has all these parts, I don't care if he worships apple trees and sacrifices chickens when the moon is full. It's not as if I've been to shrine myself in years. Zia and Yua belonged to the minority Zeri religion, a faith that had once been the dominant belief all over Sumer, while Mrs. Colbshell and her son and most of the other staff were Kafirites. Kafira Christos, who had lived and died 2,000 years before, had been a Zeri imam, but her followers had broken away from the main faith upon her death and her supposed resurrection. Now millions worshipped her as the holy Savior and the daughter of God, and those ethnic Zur who remained true to their faith, and the few converts to the Zeri religion, were the subjects in most places of animosity, prejudice, and discrimination. At least they were in most places outside the Deschantain home. Miss Deschantain would brook none of that. Excuse me, said a voice from the doorway. Everyone in the room turned to see Master Terence leaning nonchalantly against the doorframe. None of the staff were sure just how long he had been standing there. Mrs. C., could I get one of those sandwiches? I'm really not in the mood to sit through one of Yolante's luncheons. Mrs. Colbshell had the plate in his hand almost before he finished speaking, and though he hadn't asked for one, she pressed a chilly bottle of beer into his other hand. Thanks, he said, turning and walking out of the servants' hall. Nobody noticed that Yua was giving him just the same sort of look that she had been receiving from young Saba just a few minutes before. That's the end of Chapter 1 of Brechalon, Book 0 in the series The Sorceress and the Dragon. Once again, you can download an ebook version of Brechalon at smashwords.com, absolutely free. And the remaining books of the series, books 1 through 10 of The Sorceress and the Dragon, can be purchased wherever ebooks are sold. Thanks for listening, and thanks for dropping by. Stay safe. Bye-bye.